Okay class, welcome to Unit 2 Development. This is the second video. This video will be covering childhood and infancy, and we'll be particularly looking at the physical and cognitive developments of this age group. Okay, so let's talk about the age group that we'll be looking at. So this age group starts at about 3 months. Again, it could be a little bit of flexible, a little bit before, a little bit after. And then 13 years old, so kind of getting into that adolescent time period. Infancy covers the newborn to the toddler stage, and newborn is pretty much from the time period in which you're born and to about toddler, and toddler is usually about 1 or 2 when they begin walking. And then childhood is like toddler to teenage, so kind of just bunches these groups together. With this, remember, this is the unit overview I talked about in the first presentation. We particularly are looking at infancy and childhood in this presentation. We will be covering everything that's in red. So the bio section, we'll be looking at the biological changes in a child and an infant. And we'll also be talking about some psychological changes in an infant and childhood in this presentation. So let's begin with the physical changes. What is happening with the brain? This covers the biological section of an infant and a child. Well, when a child is born, the brain development, a child is born with most of the neurons that they are going to use in their life. After birth, usually they're creating neural networks and they grow wild. And you can see from about birth, they have a little bit of neural networks on that picture. At 3 months, it's growing, it's expanding a little bit more, and then 15 months, look at all the connections that you're making, connections of connecting, the word mama with your mom, connecting the word doggy with the dog, connecting another neural network that you could be fostering is the ability to physically walk. So all those neural networks are beginning to develop. At about puberty, the expansion of this begins to decline in what is called as the pruning process. It doesn't grow as rapid, and if you're not using those neural networks, they kind of begin to decay. Neural networks, the other part of the brain that's really beginning to grow at this point in time, again, the whole brain is beginning to mature, but the 2 big areas are the frontal lobe, which we talked about in class, critical thinking, and the association areas, so the higher level thinking in each of those lobes, your math skills, your reasoning skills, your logic. Okay, another thing with physical development is this term called maturation. Your brain, or you yourself, grows at in a certain pace that it's supposed to. So maturation is the gradual unfolding of a genetic blueprint and the orderly of change over time. So an example of this would be when you're learning how to, let's say, some motor developments, you're not just all of a sudden going to, at 3 months, going to go from rolling over to standing up. The events that are going to have to take place is you're going to have to learn to hold your head up, you're going to roll over, you're maybe going to be able to push your arms up, and then you're going to be able to slowly begin the army crawl, and then you'll be able to stand, and then you're going to be able to walk. So this happens in a sequence of events. The development of a brain unfolds based on a genetic instructions, causing various bodily and mental functions to occur in a sequence. Standing before walking, babbling before talking, this is called maturation. So you're going to say dot, 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 dot before you're able to say dad. Okay, these are the development, some developmental norms are rolling over, crawling, standing, walking, which we talked about. So here's a picture of first infants begin to roll over, next they sit unsupported, they begin to crawl, and finally they begin to walk. Okay, experience has little effect on the sequence. So another thing that you're going to notice is this is the pattern that they have it in, the sequence that they have it in, but some kids can have the events happen at very different time periods. So me looking at a boy and a girl, I see a girl beginning to walk. Colleen began to walk particularly at 12 months. And I see Phil, he followed the sequence, the same order as her, but the time period in which he's beginning to walk is a little bit different. It's about 15 months. Maturation and infant memory, so why babies can't remember certain things. Thank goodness we don't remember all of our early experiences. The earliest memory is never before what they say 3.5, because our minds are not fully developed at this point in time. Infantile amnesia, our brains are not fully able to remember such memories, so usually they document experiences of children years later being able to ask who was a part of their class or their preschool class, and they can pick 1 out of every 5 kids, showing a little bit of their memory. By kindergarten years, most kids can remember this. So the hippocampus and the temporal lobe are not fully developed at this point in time, leading to us not being able to remember certain things. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the cognitive development of infancy and childhood. So cognition refers to the mental activities associated with thinking, knowing, remembering, and communicating. So this particularly is going to be looking at what age should children be able to remember something, or to be able to have the skill to be able to complete a certain task. Jean Piaget in 1920 started researching and exploring this certain area. He was exploring the IQ testing, and they were developing the IQ test, and what they noticed was kids over and over in a certain age group weren't able to complete a certain number of tasks. So he created a hypothesis and said, I think kids have certain stages of development that they must attain before they can have that abstract thought. And then he did a lot of research on this. He thought children develop cognitively in a set of stages, beginning with understanding our reflexes to abstract thoughts as adults. So the first thing he kind of came up with was he believed the idea that we have schemas. We have developed mental molds in which we pour our experiences. To understand how we adjust our schemas, Piaget proposed ideas. So I think of schemas as we have a bunch of different file folders in our heads. If I said the word ball to you, you'd be able to go into your little file folder in your head and be able to pull out that image of what a ball is I'm talking about. Now we have a lot of different schemas in our head that describe a lot of different balls now, because we are intellectually probably smarter than most kids. We have volleyballs, basketballs, tennis balls, but they fall into that mold. So the first time little kids learn a term and they learn a new thing, they try to assimilate it to that one experience that they know. So assimilation is we interpret new experiences into current schemas that we have. So you guys do this all the time. When I explain maybe a new vocab word, you try and find something that it's similar to help you relate it. Accommodation is when you adjust the understanding and create a new schema, essentially. So here's our little example with Johnny down there. Okay, Johnny's dad's reading him a book about a cow. Okay, he doesn't have a schema for a cow. So he develops a schema for a cow, which is a 4-legged animal that maybe goes moo. Okay. Johnny's then dad takes him to the zoo. Okay. He sees a moose. All right. What Johnny's going to do is he's going to try and call it a cow. Assimilate. Cow, cow. The dad says, no, that's a moose. So then he has a new schema for moose. Moose. Okay. And that's when he accommodated it. He adjusts or created a new understanding. The last stage he goes to is then they go to a certain area of the zoo that has the horse. And he says, moose, moose. And the dad says, no, that's not a moose, that's a horse. And so then he has to create another new file for a horse. So this is what kids do. Sometimes we do it as well. We try and assimilate those words before we accommodate it and make a new folder. Piaget believed that with this, we go through 4 different stages of cognitive development. So as we go through it, I know I have a chart in your packet. You might want to make sure you have the age group for each stage, a description for each stage, and the developmental phenomenon that's occurring with each stage. So let's go to stage 1. Stage 1 is the sensory motor stage. So it's when babies take in the world by looking, hearing, touching. They use their mouthing, they use their mouth for everything, and grasping everything. Active play is highly encouraged. They're exploring their world for the first time. If you ever show a flashlight to a new baby, they're going to stare at it, they're going to put it in their mouth, they're going to try and figure out what this new piece or item is, and it's glowing and it's fun. It's usually between age of birth and 2 years. The developmental phenomenon that's beginning to occur, so the thought process they're actually going through at this point in time, is object permanence. Okay, so once they kind of think when they're little, very little, you play peekaboo with a 3-month-old, and you put your hands over your face, and then you come back and say, boo. When you put your hands over the face, they actually think the item goes away. Okay, they don't have the thought process that you remain here. So here's a little girl that she's 8 months old, and she has her little doggy there, and her mom covers up the doggy, and for a little kid, they think maybe for like a 6-month-old, they would think that that item is totally gone. Okay, but at this point in time, she's learning that if she just removes the cloth, the doggy is right there, so she is understanding object permanence, that it's not totally going away. Okay, the next stage is pre-operational stage. Piaget suggests them from about 2 years to 6 age children are in the developmental stage of pre-operational. They're too young to perform mental operations at this point in time. Pretend play and fantasy are really encouraged at this point in time. They're exploring their world. They have trouble understanding this concept of conservation. And so conservation is not the developmental phenomenon for pre-operational. They struggle with this stage. Okay, they don't understand that here's a little girl. Conservation is the quality remains the same even though the shape changes. So she has 2 glasses of milk. She knows that the 2 glasses of milk are exactly the same. Okay. However, when the mom pours the exact one of the jars into a taller glass, okay, and you ask the little girl which glass has more milk, okay, she's going to say the taller glass, even though she watched the mom pour the one glass to another. Okay, so that's conservation. They don't understand it. The developmental phenomenon that's occurring at this point in time is egocentrism, which is they're very self-centered and they only see the world from their point of view. So if you ever saw a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old standing right in front of the TV and you're like, hey, move out of the way, they really think, that you can see through them because they don't understand other points of view. Okay, a theory of mind is what they're beginning to develop as well. Theory of mind is the ability to infer or understand other people's points of view, mental states. And I learned that kids can really start understanding other people's points of view by reading to them and telling them stories and to talk about why the little dog in the book feels left out because his friends are picking on him. They start to learn empathy for others at this point in time. Piaget thought that this didn't happen until the age of 8, but we now know that it begins to happen at the ages of 4 and 5. And this is Vygotsky learned, he's a researcher that worked under Piaget. We learned that he actually explored this area and found out that, no, maybe Piaget is wrong. The theory of mind begins to develop a little bit earlier. The next stage of Piaget, the 3rd stage, is the concrete operational stage. So you could probably assume what kids are going to be able to understand at this time. They're going to be able to understand conservation. The developmental stage is called the concrete operational stage. It happens between 7 to 11. A child develops the ability of irreversibility, conservation, and mental operations. The developmental phenomenon, like we talked about, is conservation, the principle that quality remains the same despite the change in shape. Mental operations are beginning to occur, the ability of solving problems, doing simple math, all begins to happen between the age of 7 and 11. Think about the different operations you were able to do from 1st grade maybe until about 6th grade. Okay, you were beginning to write sentences with verbs, adjectives, nouns. You were able to complete simple math. Maybe you were beginning to write a paragraph with a topic sentence and a conclusion. Maybe you were able to read, I would say maybe you were just beginning to be able to read. Those are all the mental operations that happen at this time. Okay, so concrete operational stage. In concrete operational stage, given concrete materials, 6 to 7-year-olds grasp conservation problems and then mentally pour liquids back and forth into glass of different shapes and their qualities and understand it's the same thing. Children in this stage are able to transform mental functions. So if 4 plus 8 is 12, then the transformation then is 12 minus 4 is 8. Okay, so now we're in the formal operational stage. This is pretty much from probably 7th and 8th grade to high school. Okay, around the age of 12, our reasoning ability expands from concrete thinking to abstract thinking. We now use symbols and imagine realities to systematically reason. Piaget called this developmental stage formal operational thinking. Abstract thought, think about issues like being more accepted by peers, and abstract issues like love and fairness and reasoning. You understand that maybe, if I gave you, or if your mom gave your little brother a punishment where he had to stay in his room for 2 hours, and your punishment now is a lot different because of the consequences. You start understanding consequences. Maybe you have higher consequences. Not only is it that you stole the cookie off the counter, but you also stole from your parents, and now you disappointed your parents, and you have like a higher understanding of all this. You have hypothetical reasoning. You can do abstract reasoning. You can do deductive reasoning and reflexive abilities. And we'll talk more about this stage in class. Okay, so I would make sure you have everything on this chart written in your chart. We will talk about stranger anxiety in class for the first one and a little bit more in detail on this, but make sure you have most of the materials in this in your notes. Reflecting on Piaget, Piaget remains one of the most significant psychologists in history of science. He was recognized as one of the top 20 psychologists of all time. While he may have been a little off with the ages of his stages, his emphasis was more on the sequence. So some people argue that, maybe concrete happens a little bit earlier for some kids than he said 7 or 8. But what we do know is the milestones in which they approach them, so the sequence of events. Studies from around the world have confirmed that human cognition unfolds basically the same if you are in China to when you're in the United States. Like I said, he was one of the most influential theories. Piaget remained one of the most significant psychologists of all time. Another thing is maybe not so good about Piaget is they found development is more continuous. So Piaget thought that kind of like once you get to that stage, then you go to the next stage. And abstract doesn't happen maybe in the concrete level. But what they're finding today is, however, more people see it as more continuous. Maybe they have some abstract thoughts in earlier stages, and they might be exploring some earlier ideas, but he thought that no, you don't get to abstract until later. He also didn't think that maybe social factors influenced kids as they do, as other researchers have found that social influences really also impact cognitive influences. So Piaget believed that social influence development, but Vygotsky really explored this area. Vygotsky came up with the idea of zone of proximal development. He thought that kids could be ready for a new skill, and how they actually get to the next stage is because of their parents. So if I worked with my kid with understanding conservation, and I explored that area with my 4-year-old over and over and over again, and we looked at many different examples of this, and they may be able to reach concrete at an earlier stage because I'm working with my child in that area. So social factor maybe plays a big area in cognitive development. If I'm reading to my kids more, that's going to increase their vocabulary, that's going to increase their knowledge. It's going to be better for them in the future. Okay, so kind of recapping what we explored in this lecture. Okay, you explored the infant, childhood and infant physical development with maturation and infantile amnesia. And we also looked at the cognitive development of an individual, of a child. You should understand schemas, assimilation, accommodation. You should understand the 4 stages of Piaget's framework, which is sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete, formal. You should understand Vygotsky's 2 ideas of theory of mind and zone of proximal development.